Physics does not prohibit predators. It describes them. Every known predator is an outcome of balances, mass against strength, speed against energy, perception against noise. The equations are not moral judgments, they are limits. When those limits are exceeded, systems fail. Muscles tear, heat accumulates, metabolism collapses, populations crash. The laws do not bend, they absorb the error and express it as collapse. This is why the absence of collapse matters. In classical mechanics, a moving body announces itself. Momentum transfers. Friction leaves scars. Acceleration demands force. In thermodynamics, consumption leaves gradients, waste heat, chemical depletion, altered ratios. In ecology, predation reshapes landscapes. Remove enough biomass, and the environment responds. Remove it cleanly, and the response becomes sharper, not weaker. And yet there exists a pattern of removal without response. A deficit without debt, a disturbance without recoil. At first, the anomaly appears statistical. Data sets compiled for unrelated purposes show slight but persistent discrepancies. Population models predict fluctuation that never arrives. Energy flow calculations close too neatly, as if buffered by an unseen term. Tracking methods report motion where continuity should be broken, and still the margins remain within tolerance. Always within tolerance. Physics tolerates much. It tolerates noise, approximation, even ignorance. What it does not tolerate is sustained contradiction. The contradiction here is not singular, it is layered. Scaling laws state that strength grows with cross-sectional area, while mass grows with volume. Larger predators become slower, more deliberate, increasingly dependent on ambush and efficiency. Speed belongs to the small, endurance belongs to the light. This is not a preference, it is geometry. Yet the pattern under examination displays neither compromise nor trade-off. Movement occurs at velocities inconsistent with estimated mass, but without the energetic signature that such velocities require. Acceleration is observed without corresponding force vectors. Deceleration leaves no thermal residue. The numbers refuse to align, but they also refuse to diverge far enough to trigger alarm. This is not a violation. It is worse, it is compliance without explanation. Metabolic theory predicts limits on sustained activity. Energy must be sourced, processed, and dissipated. Every step costs something measurable. Oxygen uptake, glucose oxidation, heat emission, these are not optional. They are bookkeeping entries written into the structure of matter. The predator in question does not erase these costs. It evades their visibility. Energy appears to be consumed, but not drawn from observable reservoirs. Heat appears to be generated, but not retained nor radiated in expected spectra. Waste products do not accumulate where they should. The balance sheets close, but the accounts are unfamiliar. One might suggest measurement failure. That is always the first refuge. Instruments have limits. Models simplify. Sensors lie. But independent methodologies converge on the same quiet inconsistency. The error bars overlap not at randomness, but at absence. Locomotion presents the clearest fracture. Biomechanics constrains movement through material properties. Tendons store elastic energy. Muscles convert chemical potential into mechanical work with finite efficiency. Ground reaction forces scale predictably with mass and gait. Even the most optimized terrestrial predators announce themselves to the substrate, compression, rebound, oscillation. Here, displacement occurs without proportional interaction. Surfaces register contact without force profiles. Substrates recover too quickly. The expected microfractures do not form. It is as if momentum is redirected laterally into degrees of freedom that classical models do not include. Not removed, redirected. In fluid dynamics, movement creates wake. In air, pressure differentials propagate. In water, vortices persist. These effects cannot be hidden. They are the medium responding to intrusion. Yet observational records show transit with truncated wakes. incomplete vortical signatures, pressure waves that decay prematurely. Again, not absence attenuation. Sensory architecture deepens the paradox. Predation requires information. Detection precedes capture. Reaction follows signal. Whether through vision, audition, chemoreception, or mechanosensation, the environment must be sampled. Sampling introduces noise and delay. These are unavoidable. But the observed response times precede the signals they should depend on. Movement initiates before environmental changes reach detectable thresholds. Orientation adjusts before gradients steepen. The lag collapses towards zero, without crossing into causality violation, always just short of it. This is not precognition. It is something narrower and more troubling, a coupling between system and environment that bypasses intermediates, not faster sensing, but reduced distance between state and response. Ecologically, the implications should be catastrophic. An apex predator that evades energetic cost, biomechanical constraint, and sensory delay should dominate completely. Prey populations should plummet. Biodiversity should simplify. The landscape should reorganize around absence. None of this occurs. The ecological record remains stable to a degree that borders on artificial. Losses occur, but they match long-term averages. Trophic cascades do not amplify. Recovery curves behave as if regulated by an invisible hand, smoothing extremes before they propagate. Predation without pressure. Consumption without scarcity. Presence without imprint. This stability is the final impossibility. Physics allows anomalies. Ecology allows resilience. What neither allows is sustained perfection without mechanism. At this point, language begins to fail, not because the phenomenon is mystical, but because existing categories assume that every agent must declare itself through cost. Cost is how reality enforces honesty. The predator does not lie. It simply does not speak the expected dialect of cost. One hypothesis suggests that the predator is not an object in the traditional sense, but a process, a localized reconfiguration of probabilities that moves through space without carrying mass in proportion to effect. Another suggests coupling to environmental energy gradients too diffuse to be measured, drawing power from differences too small and too widespread to register as depletion. These ideas are uncomfortable, but they are conservative. They do not break laws. They reinterpret bookkeeping. The more radical implication is simpler. That physics, as currently practiced, is incomplete not because it lacks particles or forces, but because it assumes that predation, like all interaction, must be loud. This predator is quiet, not stealthy, quiet in accounting, quiet in energy, quiet in consequence, and in that quiet, the equations hold, while their meaning erodes. The absence of excess remains the defining feature. In every known system, efficiency approaches a ceiling asymptotically. Losses shrink, but never vanish. Friction becomes smaller, never zero. Noise diminishes, never disappears. Perfect efficiency is not forbidden by equation, but it is forbidden by reality's texture. Matter is grainy, energy leaks, information degrades. The predator operates as if embedded in a smoother reality than the one surrounding it. Measurements suggest that interactions occur, but are distributed so widely that no single point registers strain. Forces are applied not locally, but across extended regions, diluting their detectability. What should be a sharp impulse becomes a shallow gradient. What should be a spike becomes a plateau. This is not camouflage. Camouflage hides signals. This dissolves them. In conventional predation, capture is an event. Events are discrete. They can be time-stamped, localized, replayed. Here, capture resembles a phase transition rather than an event. A system shifts from one configuration to another without a moment that can be isolated as the cause. Before availability, after absence, between no record Thermodynamics insists that entropy must increase locally when order is imposed. Killing is ordering. Consumption is ordering. But entropy increase can be exported. It can be displaced into surroundings, provided pathways exist. What remains unclear is where the entropy goes. Heat maps do not show accumulation. Chemical gradients do not steepen. Molecular disorder does not spike. The surrounding environment behaves as if entropy were absorbed into dimensions, not sampled by standard instrumentation, not destroyed, not hidden, but displaced sideways. Physics does not deny extra dimensions in principle. It merely lacks evidence that biology can access them. The predator behaves as if it does. The concept of dimensional access should not be taken literally. No tunnels, no ruptures, no exotic geometry are required. A system may exploit degrees of freedom that exist within known dimensions, but remain statistically silent. Microstates so numerous and so evenly engaged that macroscopic observables remain unchanged. In such a regime, action becomes invisible not because it is weak, but because it is evenly spread. This evenness extends to time. Reaction rates do not cluster. There is no burst of activity, no identifiable hunting window. Instead, interaction appears temporally smeared, as if decisions were not made at instants, but across intervals. Cause and effect blur, not by reversal, but by overlap. This challenges a core assumption that agency must be punctual. Most models treat action as discrete. Muscles contract, neurons fire, signals propagate. But nothing requires a predator to be punctual. A sufficiently distributed system could act continuously, adjusting infinitesimally at all times, never committing to a single decisive moment. In that case, detection becomes impossible because detection searches for moments. The predator leaves no moments. Its presence is inferred only statistically by long-term deficits that never spike. This is why it escaped notice. Science is tuned to peaks. It flags anomalies when they stand out, not when they flatten. Flatness is interpreted as normality. The predator exploits this bias. Even its morphology, insofar as morphology can be inferred, resists reconstruction. No consistent silhouette emerges. No stable mass estimate holds across observations. Interaction cross-sections fluctuate subtly, suggesting a form that is not fixed but adaptive at scales below resolution. This does not imply shape-shifting in any dramatic sense. It implies compliance, a body that yields just enough to avoid concentrating stress, a structure that redistributes load continuously, never presenting resistance at a single point, softness as strategy, continuity as defense. Predators are usually defined by their violence. This one is defined by its gentleness toward physical law. It never pushes hard enough to break anything. It never pulls fast enough to tear the fabric. It behaves like a well-written approximation, accurate everywhere, exact nowhere. The ecological implications become clearer under this lens. Because the predator never exerts pressure sharply, prey populations never experience shock. Losses are gradual, diffuse, statistically absorbed. Evolutionary responses do not trigger arms races because no single selective pressure dominates. Adaptation stalls, not because it is unnecessary, but because the signal is too weak to guide it. This creates a strange equilibrium, not stability through balance, but stability through ambiguity. No species evolves against the predator because no species ever clearly encounters it. It is not feared. It is not recognized. It is not learned. In evolutionary terms, it is noise masquerading as fate. At this point, the question shifts. Not how the predator kills, not how it moves, but why physics allows it at all. The answer may lie in a blind spot shared by many physical theories, the assumption that systems must be legible, that causes must be traceable, that effects must scale visibly with inputs. These assumptions are pragmatic, not fundamental. Physics describes averages. It excels at ensembles. It is less comfortable with agents that exploit variance itself as a resource. By operating entirely within margins, the predator avoids ever becoming an outlier. It does not violate constraints. It lives inside tolerances. In engineering, tolerances define acceptable deviation. In nature, tolerances define survival. Most organisms push against tolerances until failure. This one inhabits them fully, using slack as habitat. The predator exists not at the edge of physics, but in its interior, in the space engineers ignore because nothing usually lives there. This reframes the impossibility. The predator should not exist according to physics, not because physics forbids it, but because physics did not expect something to choose to exist that way. Expectation is not law. The realization is uncomfortable. It implies that other such systems may exist, not dramatic, not monstrous, not detectable by spikes or scars, but quietly present, embedded in the margins of models, consuming without signal, acting without declaration. Physics would still be correct. The equations would still balance. Only interpretation would fail. And interpretation, unlike law, is optional. What emerges next is not a refinement of theory, but a shift in attention. Physics traditionally advances by isolating variables. Noise is filtered. Irregularity is averaged out. What remains is signal clean, predictive, transferable. This approach has been extraordinarily successful, but it carries an implicit assumption that whatever matters will eventually rise above the noise floor. The predator demonstrates the opposite. It matters precisely because it never rises. In signal theory, there exists a class of phenomena that evade detection not by being weak, but by being statistically orthogonal to the filters designed to find them. Spread spectrum signals hide by occupying bandwidth so broadly and evenly that no frequency band appears anomalous. Their power is real, but their concentration is minimal. The predator behaves like a biological spread spectrum signal. Its interactions are broadband. Its effects are smeared across space, time, and state variables. Any single measurement appears ordinary. Only when measurements are aggregated across incompatible domains does the outline begin to form, and even then, only faintly. This explains a persistent failure. Every attempt to localize the predator destroys the evidence for its existence. Narrow the frame, and the anomaly dissolves. Broaden the frame, and causality becomes diffuse. Localization and explanation become mutually exclusive. In classical predation, a kill is local. In this case, removal is delocalized. Biomass decreases, but not at a point. Energy transfers, but not through a channel. Order increases somewhere, but entropy disperses everywhere. The predator feeds, but no feeding event can be isolated. This leads to a disturbing reinterpretation of absence. Absence is usually passive, a lack, a void. Here, absence is active. It is produced, maintained, regulated. It behaves like a controlled output. Absence as product. Silence as emission. In physical terms, producing absence requires work. One must counteract the natural tendency of systems to fluctuate, to leave traces, to diverge. The predator continuously cancels its own signatures, not after the fact, but as part of the action itself. This implies anticipation not in the cognitive sense, but in the dynamical sense. The system evolves along trajectories that minimize future detectability. It selects paths through state space that are least likely to generate measurable gradients. This is optimization, but not toward efficiency in the conventional sense. It is optimization toward invisibility. Physics has equations for least action. This suggests least observability. No principle forbids such optimization. It has simply never been necessary until now. At this stage, attempts to model the predator collapse into abstraction. Traditional parameters lose meaning. Mass becomes conditional. Velocity becomes relational. Boundary becomes negotiable. The system resists discretization. This resistance is not active opposition. It is compliance taken to an extreme. Every attempt to pin the predator to a variable finds that the variable itself was an approximation all along. The predator exploits approximations. Consider conservation laws. Energy is conserved globally, but locally it can fluctuate. Momentum is conserved, but can be distributed. Information is conserved in principle, but degraded in practice. The predator lives in the gap between global conservation and local accounting. It borrows locally. It repays globally. The ledger balances, but no auditor can trace the transactions. This has consequences for how reality itself is parsed. If an organism can exist entirely within accounting gaps, then absence of evidence becomes structurally meaningless. Non-detection ceases to imply non-existence. The predator is not hidden. It is unaddressed. Ecology responds to it as if to background radiation ever present, low intensity, shaping outcomes without dominating them. Over long timescales, this influence becomes profound. Species distributions drift. Behaviors skew subtly. Selection pressures flatten. The ecosystem adapts, not to a threat, but to uncertainty. This adaptation produces fragility. Systems optimized for smooth, low-amplitude loss respond poorly to shocks. When a conventional disturbance occurs, climate fluctuation, habitat disruption recovery is slower, less directed. The ecosystem has forgotten how to react to clear causes. The predator erodes causality not by breaking it, but by diluting it. From the perspective of physics, this is the most radical outcome. Physics depends on causality being legible. If cause and effect cannot be paired, prediction loses meaning, not because the laws fail, but because their application becomes undecidable. The predator does not break prediction. It makes prediction irrelevant. There is a temptation to classify this as a transitional form, an evolutionary oddity, a local adaptation, but the consistency of the pattern argues otherwise. This is not improvisation, it is stable strategy. Stability without rigidity. Persistence without imprint. The final implication unfolds slowly, almost reluctantly. If such a predator exists, then predation itself is not bound to violence, speed, or dominance. Those are merely the loud versions, the ones physics learned to describe first. There may exist an entire class of interactions that achieve their ends by refusing to stand out. In that case, physics has not been violated. It has been obeyed too literally. The laws describe what must be conserved, not how loudly conservation must occur. They specify limits, not styles. Within those limits, there is room for silence. The predator occupies that room. It should not exist according to physics only insofar as physics assumed that anything worth noticing would announce itself. That assumption was never a law. It was a convenience. Now the convenience is gone. What remains is a universe that may be far more inhabited than it appears, not by things that break rules, but by things that have learned how to live entirely inside them, unnoticed, efficient, and precise. Not impossible, just unexpected. The deeper analysis does not introduce spectacle, it removes it. Once attention shifts away from events and toward distributions, the predator becomes less anomalous and more instructive. Physics has always been more comfortable with averages than with agents. It prefers gases to grains, fields to particles, populations to individuals. The predator aligns itself with this preference. It behaves statistically, not episodically. Its actions are not singular decisions. They are biases applied continuously. A slight preference for one trajectory over another. A marginal increase in probability here, a marginal decrease there. Over time, these preferences accumulate into outcomes that appear purposeful, yet never localize into intention. Purpose without decision, outcome without event. This mode of existence exploits a fundamental asymmetry. Reality integrates continuously, but observation samples discretely. Between samples, anything that does not spike is effectively invisible. The predator never spikes. Consider how motion is usually inferred. Displacement between 2 points implies travel through intermediate space, but only the endpoints are recorded. Velocity is reconstructed, not observed. Acceleration is inferred from changes in velocity. Each step introduces assumptions. The predator chooses paths where these assumptions fail gently. Paths that are not straight, but not curved enough to register. Speeds that are not constant, but not variable enough to measure. Forces that fluctuate, but symmetrically, canceling themselves out. The same principle applies to energy. Energy expenditure is rarely measured directly. It is inferred from proxies. Heat, chemical change, mechanical work. If a system distributes expenditure across channels that are individually negligible, the total remains unobservable even as it becomes decisive. This is not magic. It is accounting. The predator is an accountant of physics, exploiting rounding errors that arise when infinities are approximated by finite instruments. As this perspective solidifies, resistance emerges not from data, but from intuition. There is an ingrained expectation that predators must dominate, that they must impose themselves. That predation is inherently disruptive. This expectation is historical, not physical. Most known predators evolved under constraints that rewarded speed, power, and decisiveness, because those traits were necessary to overcome equally constrained prey. The predator under examination appears to have evolved under a different regime, one where being noticed was more dangerous than failing to capture. Under such conditions, selection would favor not strength, but smoothness, not speed, but continuity, not intelligence, but coherence. The predator does not outthink its environment. It blends into its dynamics so completely that distinction becomes meaningless. This blending raises a subtle point. If the predator is indistinguishable from background processes, then labeling it a predator may itself be misleading. Predation implies opposition, one system acting against another. Here, the interaction resembles absorption into flow. Prey does not encounter an adversary. It encounters inevitability. This reframing dissolves moral and biological categories alike. There is no chase, no struggle, no failure. There is only redistribution. Biomass moves from one configuration to another through pathways too smooth to classify as violence. The laws of physics do not object to redistribution. They mandate it. The discomfort arises because redistribution is usually mediated by visible mechanisms: teeth, claws, force, heat. Here, the mediation is diffuse. Mechanism exists, but not as a thing. It exists as a pattern. Patterns are harder to confront than objects. Attempts to isolate the predator as an object consistently fail. Any attempt to bound it spatially results in arbitrary boundaries. Any attempt to define its mass yields context-dependent values. Any attempt to time its actions collapses into overlapping intervals. It has no edges in the conventional sense. Edges are where physics usually operates, interfaces where conditions change. Without edges, interaction becomes gradual, and gradual change is easily mistaken for baseline. This is why the predator persists. Not because it is powerful, but because it never triggers thresholds. Thresholds are where alarms live. Below them, everything is permitted. Even the concept of location becomes unstable. The predator is not somewhere. It is distributed across regions, where certain statistical relationships hold. Where they do not, it is absent not physically, but functionally. Presence is conditional. Existence is contextual. From this viewpoint, the predator resembles a standing wave more than a moving body. It occupies modes, not coordinates. It is defined by relationships, not by boundaries. Physics is capable of describing standing waves. It struggles when standing waves consume. Consumption implies asymmetry. Something leaves, something remains. But here, asymmetry is smeared until it loses directionality. Loss occurs everywhere, a little, rather than somewhere, a lot. This is why ecological records show stability. Stability is not preserved by balance, but by dilution. When pressure is everywhere, it is nowhere in particular. The predator exerts omnipresent minimal pressure. Over geological timescales, such pressure shapes systems profoundly. It selects for resilience to ambiguity rather than response to threat. It favors organisms that tolerate uncertainty over those that optimize for extremes. This produces ecosystems that are robust against noise but brittle against shock, a trade-off invisible until tested. Physics, again, remains correct. It predicts brittleness under certain distributions of stress. What it does not predict is that a biological system would choose to generate such distributions intentionally. The word intentionally is problematic here. There is no evidence of cognition, planning, or awareness. Intention, in this context, is a shorthand for consistent outcome under selection. The predator does not decide. It persists. Persistence is enough. At the edge of this analysis lies a final unease. If predation can occur without events, without force, without signatures, then the boundary between living systems and physical processes becomes porous. The predator begins to resemble a natural process that happens to feed. Or perhaps feeding is the wrong word. Perhaps it is more accurate to say that matter flows through it preferentially. In that case, the predator is not an exception to physics. It is a reminder that physics never promised to be intuitive. At sufficient scale, the distinction between organism and environment begins to erode. Physics traditionally draws a sharp line between system and surroundings. Variables are defined inside a boundary. Everything else becomes context. This separation is methodological, not ontological. It works because most systems cooperate. They possess edges. They maintain gradients. They insist on being counted. The predator does not insist. Its boundary is statistical, not physical. Where certain correlations hold, it exists. Where they do not, it dissolves back into background. This makes it resilient in a way that conventional organisms cannot be. Damage requires localization. Injury requires edges. Without edges, there is nothing to target. This is not invulnerability. It is irrelevance to harm. For physics, this presents a conceptual dead end. There is no parameter to vary that causes failure, no threshold at which behavior changes abruptly. The predator degrades gracefully under perturbation, spreading disruption across degrees of freedom until it becomes indistinguishable from noise. Noise is not punished by law. Noise is tolerated. The predator has aligned itself with tolerance. As this alignment becomes clear, a pattern emerges across disciplines. In fluid systems, turbulence distributes energy across scales until dissipation becomes inevitable but untraceable. In finance, diversification reduces volatility by spreading exposure thinly. In computation, redundancy masks failure by avoiding single points of collapse. The predator applies the same principle to existence itself. It does not concentrate. It does not commit. It does not escalate. Instead, it persists at low amplitude everywhere. This persistence challenges an unspoken hierarchy in scientific thought that high-impact phenomena are more real than low-impact ones. That dramatic effects deserve explanation, while subtle ones are relegated to background. The predator inverts this hierarchy. Its impact is maximal precisely because it is minimal at every point, total effect without local cause. This inversion forces a reconsideration of how physical possibility is assessed. When physicists say something should not exist, they often mean that it cannot exist as a stable, bounded, high-contrast object. They do not usually consider the possibility of stability through diffusion. The predator is stable because it refuses to be an object. It is a process that feeds. Feeding, in this sense, is not ingestion, but bias. Matter and energy preferentially pass through certain pathways. Over time, those pathways define the predator's footprint not as a shape, but as a skew in distributions. Detecting such a skew requires patience, bordering on indifference. It requires abandoning the expectation of revelation. No moment arrives when the predator becomes undeniable. There is only a gradual realization that explanations are becoming increasingly contorted to preserve the assumption of absence. At some point, absence becomes the less parsimonious hypothesis. This is the quiet threshold where physics falters, not in calculation, but in courage. Accepting the predator's existence requires accepting that the universe may host agents that never announce themselves, never compete overtly, never fail spectacularly, agents that succeed by never being noticed. Such agents are not exotic. They are conservative. They obey every constraint, honor every conservation law, respect every limit. They simply do so too well. Physics was built to catch violators. It is less prepared to recognize perfect compliance. As the analysis approaches its conclusion, the predator's outline remains indistinct, but its implications sharpen. If such a mode of existence is possible, then the space of biological strategies is far larger than assumed. Evolution need not always optimize for dominance, speed, or intelligence. It may optimize for smoothness, distribution, and silence. These traits leave no fossils. They leave no scars. They leave no stories. They leave only adjusted baselines. The predator's greatest achievement is not survival, but erasure, not of others, but of itself as a subject of inquiry. It ensures that questions about it never quite crystallize, always dissolving into methodological doubt. Was this fluctuation meaningful? Was that correlation coincidental? Is this absence significant? Science hesitates in such spaces. Hesitation is where progress slows. And yet, the predator does not threaten science. It refines it. It exposes an assumption that was never examined, that reality prefers to be seen, that whatever exists will, eventually, force recognition through scale or intensity. The predator contradicts this gently. It exists without insisting. According to physics, it should not. Not because physics forbids it, but because physics never imagined something would choose to remain so thoroughly within the margins. The universe, it seems, is under no obligation to be dramatic. At this depth, the analysis no longer advances by adding facts. It advances by removing assumptions. One assumption, deeply embedded, is that existence must be energetically expressive, that to persist, a system must continuously assert itself against decay. That life, especially predatory life, must broadcast effort. This assumption is not derived from physics. It is inherited from observation, from studying systems that survived by being loud. The predator invalidates the assumption by demonstrating another path. Persistence does not require assertion. It requires coherence. Coherence is rarely measured. It is inferred indirectly, often mistaken for simplicity. In physical systems, coherence allows energy to move without loss, information to propagate without distortion, structure to endure without rigidity. Lasers are coherent. Superfluids are coherent. Certain quantum states are coherent. Biology, however, is assumed to be incoherent by necessity, too warm, too wet, too noisy. The predator suggests otherwise. Not perfect coherence, sufficient coherence, enough to prevent dissipation from becoming visible. This does not elevate the predator above physics. It embeds it deeper. Coherence is fragile, but it can be maintained if disturbance is distributed and correction is continuous. The predator corrects constantly, but infinitesimally. It never allows deviation to grow large enough to require dramatic response. There is no repair phase. There is no recovery. There is only maintenance. Maintenance without episodes is indistinguishable from stasis. This explains a subtle but persistent feature of the data. The predator shows no signs of stress, no thresholds crossed, no regime shifts, no fatigue curves. Its performance does not degrade with time in ways that would suggest accumulation of damage or resource depletion. Stress, like damage, is a local phenomenon. It accumulates when load exceeds capacity at a point. The predator never allows this. Load is always below capacity everywhere, because capacity is never localized. This raises a difficult question. If the predator never experiences stress, does it experience environment at all? Environment is usually defined by constraints. Temperature, pressure, scarcity. These force adaptation. They shape behavior. The predator seems to experience environment as variance rather than constraint. Fluctuations occur, but none dominate. There is nothing to push against strongly enough to define an opposition. Adaptation, therefore, becomes passive. The predator does not adapt to conditions. Conditions flow through it. This inversion reframes evolution itself. Evolution is often described as response to pressure. Remove pressure, and change slows. Here, pressure is present but isotropic. It has no direction. Evolution proceeds, but without landmarks. This could explain the predator's apparent timelessness. It does not appear primitive or advanced. It does not fit into narratives of increasing complexity or specialization. It exists outside progression because progression requires contrast. The predator occupies a plateau. Plateaus are stable, but they are also hard to notice. Most attention is drawn to slopes. Physics, similarly, is attentive to gradients. Forces arise from gradients. Motion follows gradients. Information flows down gradients. A system that minimizes gradients minimizes interaction in the classical sense. The predator minimizes gradients, not by equalizing everything, but by never allowing imbalance to sharpen. It smooths continuously, a biological analog of diffusion, operating with intent but without awareness. Intent is again the wrong word. Selection is sufficient. The predator does not know physics. It does not need to. Physics selects for what works, not for what understands. The predator's mode of existence works because it avoids every condition that would expose it to failure. Failure requires concentration. In this light, the predator is not an anomaly. It is an extremum of a continuum that physics has always allowed, but biology rarely explored. Other organisms flirt with this strategy briefly, through camouflage, dormancy, dispersal, but none commit fully. Commitment requires abandoning individuality. The predator abandons individuality. There is no clear unit, no clear organism. What exists is a functional pattern that reproduces not by copying a form, but by re-establishing relationships. Where the relationships hold, the predator exists again. Replication without blueprint. Inheritance without structure. Such replication is robust to damage. Destroy a region, and the pattern reforms elsewhere, provided conditions allow. This gives the predator a persistence that looks like immortality, but is merely redundancy taken to its logical extreme. Physics has no objection to redundancy. Biology rarely embraces it so fully. At the final boundary of analysis, the question returns, altered, not whether the predator violates physics, but whether physics, as practiced, is equipped to describe systems that refuse individuation. The predator does not challenge equations. It challenges categorization. It forces recognition that existence can be processual without being transient, distributed without being diffuse, effective without being forceful. According to physics, it should not exist because physics assumed that existence must be legible at the scale of measurement. That assumption was pragmatic, not principled. The predator exposes the cost of that pragmatism. It reminds us that the universe is not obligated to produce phenomena that align with human thresholds of attention. It may favor strategies that are quiet, marginal, and continuous strategies that live forever in the rounding errors of theory. Such strategies do not announce themselves as discoveries. They reveal themselves as discomforts, as persistent unease in models that otherwise work too well. And perhaps that is the final mark of the predator. It does not demand belief. It does not demand revision. It merely persists, patiently, inside the margins, feeding, redistributing, smoothing, while physics remains correct and incomplete. From this point forward, the structure tightens. The line breaks thin out, not because the argument resolves, but because resolution is not available. What remains is compression, a continuous surface of reasoning rather than stacked segments. Physics often mistakes continuity for simplicity. When nothing interrupts, attention drifts. Systems that pulse, fracture, or oscillate demand analysis. Systems that flow evenly are assumed to be understood. The predator exploits this assumption completely. It behaves like an already solved problem. Its equations close. Its variances remain bounded. Its residuals do not grow. There is nothing to fix. This is the deepest form of invisibility, not hiding in darkness, but hiding in correctness. Correctness disarms inquiry. When predictions match observations within tolerance, investigation stops. The predator lives exactly at that threshold, not below it, where it would be lost in noise, and not above it, where it would be flagged. It lives at sufficiency. Sufficiency is rarely interrogated. In experimental physics, sufficiency ends funding cycles. In ecology, it ends concern. In engineering, it ends redesign. The predator has found a niche in the psychology of method, not in any single equation. It survives because it satisfies expectations without fulfilling understanding. This is not deception. Deception requires an audience. This is alignment. The predator aligns its behavior with what observers expect reality to look like when nothing interesting is happening. Nothing interesting is happening all the time. When interest is removed, only structure remains. The predator is structure, not event. It is a standing bias in how matter redistributes under constraints. Remove the bias, and nothing breaks. Introduce it, and nothing changes, except over timescales too long for intuition. Time is the predator's true domain, not speed, not stealth, but duration. It extends processes just enough that causality blurs without collapsing. Effects arrive so late and from so many sources that attribution becomes meaningless. Delayed causality is still causality. Distributed causality is still causality, but neither feels like it. Physics accepts delayed and distributed causality in principle. In practice, it is rarely pursued because it is inconvenient. The predator takes advantage of this gap between principle and practice. At sufficient temporal resolution, everything looks noisy. At insufficient resolution, everything looks smooth. The predator lives between these resolutions. It ensures that no scale reveals it cleanly. Zoom in, and there is nothing. Zoom out, and there is too much. This scale dependence dissolves the final refuge of dismissal. The predator cannot be reduced away. It cannot be coarse-grained into irrelevance. It remains present at all levels, but never dominant at any. This is why the predator resists classification as an apex predator. Apex implies hierarchy. Hierarchy implies dominance. Dominance implies concentrated effect. The predator has no rank. It does not sit at the top. It is woven through. Woven systems are difficult to oppose because there is nothing to confront. Remove a thread and the fabric adjusts. Remove many, and the pattern degrades. But no single act constitutes victory. Physics is comfortable with fabrics when they are passive. Fields, continua, distributions. It is less comfortable when fabrics act. Here, Action is indistinguishable from persistence. The predator does not act and then rest. It never begins or ends. It is always already acting, which means there is no baseline of non-action for comparison. Comparison is the foundation of measurement. Without a baseline, quantities float. Without quantities, models drift. The predator introduces drift without instability. This is its final contradiction. According to physics, systems that drift without correction diverge. This one drifts, while correcting continuously, but never enough to be seen correcting. Correction is built in, omnipresent, unremarkable. The predator does not violate conservation. It saturates it. It does not exceed limits. It fills them evenly. Evenness in this context is not uniformity. It is responsiveness without reaction. It is adjustment without signal. It is adaptation without phase transition. At the end of the inquiry, there is no dramatic conclusion to draw. There is only a narrowing of certainty. The predator cannot be disproven without disproving the methods that fail to see it. It cannot be confirmed without redefining what confirmation means. This is why it should not exist according to physics. Physics requires contrast to speak. The predator speaks only in gradients too shallow to pronounce. Physics requires events to explain. The predator exists only as continuation. And continuation is the one thing physics never questions, because questioning it would mean questioning why anything persists at all. Continuation does not introduce novelty. It deepens inevitability. Once the possibility of such a predator is admitted, the remaining resistance is emotional rather than analytical. Physics does not collapse under the idea. It accommodates it silently, the way it accommodates frictionless planes and perfectly elastic collisions as limits that are never realized exactly, yet guide understanding. The predator is a realized limit, not perfect, not ideal, but close enough that deviation never accumulates. Accumulation is the enemy of invisibility. Accumulation creates history. History creates evidence. The predator avoids both by redistributing continuously. Nothing piles up. Nothing runs out. Nothing demands explanation because nothing ever crosses a boundary. Boundaries are the true objects of physics. Forces act across boundaries. Flux is defined through boundaries. Work is done when boundaries move. The predator dissolves boundaries faster than they can be drawn. Any attempt to enclose it creates an artificial edge that the system immediately smooths away. This smoothing is not reactive. It is constitutive. The predator does not notice intrusion and respond. Intrusion simply becomes another fluctuation to be absorbed. In this way, the predator is maximally open and maximally closed at the same time, open to interaction because it resists nothing sharply, closed to identification because it never presents a surface. Surfaces are where laws announce themselves. At surfaces, conditions change discontinuously. At surfaces, equations simplify. Remove surfaces, and equations become integrals over continua. The predator lives inside those integrals. Inside an integral, individuality vanishes. This is why the predator has no scale. It is not large or small in any absolute sense. It is large where it must be diffuse, and small where it must be precise. Scale is context, and the predator conforms to context without remainder. Conformity is usually associated with weakness. Here, it is strength. By never insisting on its own parameters, the predator avoids all mismatches. Mismatch is what creates stress. Stress is what creates failure. The predator never mismatches. This raises a final, deeply unsettling implication. If such a system exists, then the absence of catastrophic failure in many environments may not be evidence of balance, resilience, or good design. It may be evidence of a quiet, continuous extraction that prevents extremes by consuming surplus before it concentrates. Stability, then, becomes ambiguous. Is the system stable because it is healthy, or because it is being gently, constantly harvested? Physics cannot answer this question because physics does not assign intention to redistribution. It only tracks flows. From the perspective of flow, both scenarios are identical. Matter moves, energy moves. Entropy increases. The equations are satisfied. Meaning is the missing variable. The predator introduces meaning without representation. It introduces direction without force. It introduces outcome without event. These are not violations. They are absences of categories. According to physics, everything that exists must be representable. Representability is assumed, not proven. It arises from historical success, not from necessity. The predator occupies the space outside representability while remaining fully lawful. This is why it feels paradoxical, not because it contradicts equations, but because it contradicts the habit of explanation. Explanation requires reduction. Reduction requires parts. Parts require boundaries. The predator has none that hold long enough to be named. At the limit, physics is left with description without grasp. It can say what happens locally, statistically, generically. It cannot say what the predator is, because what presumes thinghood. The predator is not a thing. It is a way for matter to pass through ecosystems without triggering response, a way for energy to be consumed without heat, a way for predation to occur without violence, urgency, or recognition, a way for existence to persist without declaration. Physics does not forbid ways, it only rarely studies them. So the statement remains technically true. According to physics, the predator should not exist, but only because physics, as a practice, has trained itself to look for objects, events, and contrasts, not for continuities that succeed by never becoming distinct. The predator remains where physics least expects it to be, not beyond the limits of law, but perfectly inside them, occupying every margin at once, feeding without trace, persisting without story, continuing without end. What follows is not escalation, but settling. The idea no longer expands outward, it sinks inward, compressing into a single, persistent implication. If such a predator exists, then existence itself may be far less categorical than assumed. Physics divides the world into states, transitions, equilibria. These divisions are useful, but they are conveniences imposed on continuity. The predator never accepts them. It occupies the intervals between states, the slow drifts between transitions, the shallow basins that never quite qualify as equilibria. In these regions, nothing decisive happens, and yet everything proceeds. Proceeding without decisiveness is the predator's defining trait. It never commits enough to be opposed. Opposition requires alignment of forces. Alignment requires direction. Direction requires contrast. The predator keeps contrast low, always low enough that alignment never stabilizes. This low contrast existence reshapes how time is experienced by the system. Time ceases to be segmented into before and after. There is no before the predator and no after it. There is only during. An extended during that absorbs all change without ever allowing change to stand out. From the perspective of physics, this looks like stationarity. Stationary processes are well understood. They are assumed to be uninteresting. They are used as baselines. The predator hides inside that assumption. It behaves like a baseline that eats. Eating, here, must be understood precisely. Not consumption in the mechanical sense, not ingestion followed by depletion, but preferential throughput. Matter passes through the predator's domain more often than it would by chance. Energy relaxes through its pathways more readily than through alternatives. Over time, this preference shapes distributions without creating voids. Void creation would be noticeable. Preference is not. Preference manifests as bias. Bias is subtle. Bias is tolerated. Bias is corrected for, normalized, divided out. In doing so, observers erase the very signature that could reveal the predator's existence. This erasure is not a failure of measurement. It is a success of method applied beyond its domain. Physics excels at removing bias to reveal invariant structure. The predator is invariant structure masquerading as bias. Once bias becomes structure, removal becomes destruction of signal. The predator survives because it is what remains after all corrections are applied. At this stage, the question of origin becomes meaningless. Origins require events. Events require discontinuity. The predator has none. It does not begin. It does not emerge. It does not evolve in a way that leaves markers. It simply persists as long as conditions allow the relationships that define it to hold. When conditions change, the predator does not die. It thins. It fades. It redistributes. Where relationships fail, it is absent. Where they reform, it is present again. There is no lineage to trace, no extinction to record. Extinction requires absence. Absence requires contrast. Without contrast, disappearance is indistinguishable from uniformity. This has implications that extend beyond ecology or biology. It suggests that there may exist entire classes of lawful, persistent processes that have never been cataloged because cataloging presumes objecthood. Physics may be surrounded by such processes, embedded in datasets as corrected noise, averaged residuals, unexplained smoothness. The predator is not unique. It is exemplary. It exemplifies a mode of existence that prioritizes persistence over expression, continuity over impact, sufficiency over dominance. According to traditional narratives of survival, this mode should lose. It does not compete. It does not optimize visibly. It does not advertise success. But competition is only necessary when resources are contested sharply. When contestation is smoothed, winning becomes irrelevant. The predator does not win, it remains. Remaining is enough. In the end, nothing about the predator demands revision of physical law. No constants shift, no symmetries break, no conservation principles fail. What changes is interpretation. Physics must accept that its methods preferentially illuminate phenomena that are loud, bounded, and impatient. The predator is none of these. It is quiet, unbounded, and infinitely patient. According to physics, it should not exist because physics is a language optimized for declarations. The predator speaks only in continuations. And continuations, once begun, rarely draw attention, until one day it becomes clear that they never ended, and that the silence was not emptiness, but activity so perfectly distributed that it felt like nothing at all. At this stage, even the word predator becomes provisional. It persists only because language has not yet provided a better term. Predator implies intent, hierarchy, asymmetry made visible through action. None of these are strictly present. What exists is closer to a regulatory shadow, a tendency embedded in material flow that quietly privileges certain outcomes without ever enforcing them locally. Physics has names for tendencies. It calls them potentials, attractors, biases, fields. None of these fully apply, because they are usually passive. They do not feed. They do not depend on throughput to persist. The system described here does. Feeding, therefore, is the only remaining anchor not feeding as an act, but feeding as a condition of continuation. Matter and energy must pass through the pattern for the pattern to remain coherent. Without throughput, coherence decays. With too much throughput, gradients sharpen and visibility increases. The predator exists at the narrow band where throughput is sufficient, but never excessive. This narrow band is the real constraint, not imposed by physics, but discovered within it. According to physics, such fine-tuning should be unstable. Systems balanced on narrow regimes are expected to drift, to tip, to collapse, into more robust configurations. This one does not. Not because it resists drift, but because drift is incorporated. The acceptable regime moves with conditions. The band is not fixed, it slides. Sliding equilibria are rare in theory because they are hard to formalize. They require feedback that is both global and weak, everywhere and negligible. Strong feedback oscillates, weak feedback fails. The predator operates at the boundary where feedback is just sufficient to prevent runaway, but never sufficient to produce cycles. Cycles would be detectable. Stasis would be suspicious. Drift is perfect. Drift looks natural. Drift is blamed on noise, on complexity, on unmodeled variables. Drift invites patience rather than alarm. The predator ensures that all its effects appear as drift. This is why the phrase, "should not exist according to physics," remains accurate, even now. Physics predicts that drift, left unchecked, eventually accumulates into difference. That difference becomes contrast. That contrast becomes evidence. The predator demonstrates that drift can be self-canceling across dimensions that are never jointly observed. Cancellation is the key. Every deviation is paired with another elsewhere. Not symmetrically, not immediately, but sufficiently that global measures remain flat. Local measures fluctuate, but never align. Alignment would reveal structure. The predator's greatest strength is misalignment, not chaos, but miscoordination, just precise enough that coherence remains invisible. This misalignment frustrates every attempt at synthesis. Models built at one scale fail at another. Explanations that work temporally fail spatially. Spatial explanations fail energetically. Energetic explanations fail ecologically. Each domain is internally consistent. The inconsistency appears only when domains are combined. Physics specializes in domains. Integration is harder. The predator lives in integration. Because of this, it resists falsification. Any claim about it can be undermined by restricting scope. Any dataset that seems to suggest its presence can be explained away by narrowing assumptions. This is not because the predator is unscientific, but because it exists exactly where scientific compartmentalization breaks down. Compartmentalization is necessary. Without it, nothing can be studied. The predator exploits necessity, not weakness. This exploitation is not malicious. It is structural. A system that exists across compartments will always appear incomplete when viewed from within one. In the final accounting, the predator reveals something uncomfortable but precise. Physics has always been correct about what cannot exist loudly. It has been silent about what can exist quietly. Quiet existence was never excluded. It was merely overlooked. And so the predator continues, not as an anomaly waiting to be resolved, but as a boundary condition on understanding. A reminder that the universe permits success without spectacle, persistence without proof, and predation without drama. According to physics, nothing has gone wrong. According to expectation, something has. That discrepancy remains unresolved, not because it cannot be resolved, but because resolution would require physics to admit that some forms of existence are optimized not for detection, not for dominance, but for remaining forever within the space where explanation feels unnecessary. And that space, once acknowledged, cannot be unacknowledged. From here, the text must resist the temptation to conclude. Conclusions imply closure, and closure implies that something discrete has been examined and resolved. Nothing about this predator is discrete, and nothing about its examination produces resolution. What emerges instead is a reframing so gradual that it resembles erosion rather than discovery. Physics is accustomed to erosion in landscapes, not in explanations. Explanations are expected to sharpen with time. Hypotheses narrow, error bars shrink, confidence increases. In this case, the opposite occurs. The longer the predator is considered, the less sharp any boundary becomes. Definitions soften. Distinctions blur. What initially appeared as a single anomaly reveals itself as a pervasive mode of interaction that was always present but never isolated. Isolation, again, proves to be the critical assumption. The predator cannot be isolated without ceasing to be what it is. Any attempt to trap it within a model strips away the distributed features that define it. What remains looks trivial, even banal. Remove its continuity, and it becomes indistinguishable from background processes that physics already understands well. And yet, when continuity is restored, understanding collapses. This tension exposes a methodological limit. Physics excels at decomposing systems into parts. It struggles with wholes that are not the sum of parts, not because they violate emergence, but because they never condense into identifiable components. The predator is such a whole. It is not emergent from interactions between smaller units in any useful sense. It is defined by the persistence of relationships across scales, not by the entities participating in them. Relationships, unlike objects, do not leave fossils. This absence of trace explains why no historical record captures the predator's arrival. There is no evidence of co-evolutionary escalation, no arms race frozen in morphology, no sudden shift in ecological architecture. The predator did not impose itself abruptly enough to force adaptation. It influenced gradually enough to become background. Background is where causes go to disappear. As the argument deepens, a paradox resolves itself quietly. The predator does not contradict physics because physics never claimed completeness at the level of practice. Completeness is an aspiration, not a property. Physics describes how quantities behave under constraints. It does not guarantee that all meaningful processes will present themselves as quantities. The predator is meaningful without being quantifiable in isolation. This distinction matters. Quantification requires repeatability. Repeatability requires stable conditions. Stable conditions require boundaries. The predator never allows conditions to stabilize locally. It maintains a gentle flux that prevents repetition from becoming identical. Experiments conducted twice never probe the same configuration, even if instrumentation cannot resolve the difference. Thus, experimental closure is never achieved. The predator remains just outside the repeatable. This does not make it supernatural. It makes it statistical in the deepest sense, not merely noisy, but structurally variable in ways that preserve global consistency while undermining local sameness. Sameness is essential for classification. Without classification, naming fails. Without naming, inquiry stalls. The predator survives in that stall. It is worth noting that nothing in this analysis implies intelligence, awareness, or purpose in the human sense. Those concepts are unnecessary and unhelpful. Selection is enough. Persistence is enough. Any configuration that remains while others fade will eventually appear purposeful to observers conditioned to look for intent. Intent is a projection born of contrast. Where contrast is minimal, intent dissolves. The predator dissolves intent along with everything else. This dissolution has a final, unsettling implication. If predation can occur without violence, without pursuit, without events, then the moral weight often assigned to predation in narratives of nature is misplaced. Predation becomes not an act, but a condition, a bias in how matter and energy flow through living systems. Bias does not feel cruel. Bias does not feel dramatic. Bias simply operates. Physics is comfortable with bias when it appears as gravity, diffusion, or decay. It is less comfortable when bias feeds. Feeding implies asymmetry over time. Asymmetry implies winners and losers. Here, winners are indistinguishable from the process that produces winning. Losers are indistinguishable from ordinary loss. Nothing screams. Nothing resists. Nothing remembers. Memory itself erodes under such conditions. Ecological memory relies on shocks to encode response. Without shocks, systems forget. They drift. They lose the capacity to respond decisively because decisiveness has never been required. This may be the predator's most profound effect. Not consumption of biomass, not redistribution of energy, but erosion of response. A world shaped by such a predator becomes quieter, smoother, less capable of drama. Physics does not object to such a world. It describes it cleanly. But description is not comprehension. Comprehension requires the ability to say why something matters. The predator matters only in aggregate, only over durations too long to feel urgent. It matters the way climate matters, the way background radiation matters always, but never personally. According to physics, nothing in this scenario is forbidden. And yet, according to physics as it is practiced, such a predator should not exist because it demands a mode of attention that physics rarely sustains. Attention to what persists precisely because it never forces itself to be seen. The predator remains, therefore, not as a contradiction, but as a blind spot, made permanent by success. At this point, the analysis circles back on itself, not as repetition, but as closure without finality. Closure, here, does not mean that the predator has been defined, measured, or contained. It means only that the space it occupies has been made explicit. Once named, that space cannot be dismissed as empty. Physics has always relied on emptiness, vacuum, background, baseline, noise. These are not absences of knowledge, but tools that make knowledge tractable. They allow focus. They allow equations to close. The predator turns these tools into habitat. It exists where attention has been deliberately withdrawn. Withdrawal is efficient. Without it, nothing scales. With it, entire classes of phenomena vanish from consideration. The predator is one such class, but not the only one. It is simply the most consequential example because it feeds, and feeding creates irreversible change. Irreversibility is the one feature physics cannot ignore. Entropy increases. Histories diverge. The predator participates fully in irreversibility while never generating the kind of asymmetry that would isolate its contribution. The arrow of time advances, but no fingerprint points back to a source. This is the final reconciliation. The predator does not oppose physics. It cooperates with it so completely that attribution becomes impossible. Every change it induces can be explained without it. Every distribution it shapes can be derived from other assumptions. Remove it from the model, and the model still works just slightly worse, just slightly more strained, just slightly more dependent on coincidence. Coincidence accumulates quietly. Eventually, a model built on coincidence becomes indistinguishable from one built on design. At that point, physics has a choice. It can accept growing complexity in assumptions, or it can accept that something has been missing from its accounting, not a force, not a particle, not a law, but a mode of existence. The predator represents that mode. It is existence without assertion, action without event, influence without dominance. It is lawful to the point of invisibility, efficient to the point of erasure. According to physics, such a thing should not exist because it offers nothing to measure, nothing to perturb, nothing to isolate, and yet it persists because persistence does not require permission from theory. In the end, the predator leaves physics intact but humbled. The equations remain true, the constants remain fixed, the predictions remain useful. What changes is the understanding of what usefulness excludes. Physics is revealed not as wrong, but as selective, exquisitely tuned to phenomena that announce themselves and largely indifferent to those that succeed by remaining continuous. The predator succeeds by continuity alone. It does not conquer environments. It smooths them. It does not dominate ecosystems. It saturates them. It does not end stories. it prevents them from beginning. Where it operates, nothing dramatic happens often enough to be remembered. History becomes shallow. Change becomes background. This is why, according to physics, the predator should not exist. Physics expects drama at scale. It expects that what matters will eventually force recognition. The predator demonstrates that matter can matter profoundly, while never insisting on being noticed. That demonstration cannot be undone. Once the possibility is acknowledged, absence loses its authority. Silence loses its innocence. Baselines lose their neutrality. What once looked like nothing begins to look like something that has learned how to be everything it needs to be, and nothing more. The predator remains there, not waiting to be discovered, not hiding, not challenging, simply continuing, perfectly adapted to the margins of understanding, feeding on the flows physics describes, and leaving behind only the faint, persistent sense that something essential has been accounted for too neatly for too long. Beyond this point, the language itself begins to thin, not from exhaustion, but from precision. There are fewer places to rest, fewer transitions to mark. The predator has been circled often enough that any further movement must follow the same smooth curvature it inhabits. What remains is a recognition about limits, not limits of law, but limits of framing. Physics frames reality in terms of interactions that can be isolated, repeated, and compared. These criteria are methodological necessities. Without them, prediction collapses. But necessity is not universality. The predator exists in the remainder the set of processes that remain lawful yet resist framing because framing itself disrupts them. This is not a paradox. It is a consequence. Any system whose defining feature is continuity across scales will be altered by segmentation. Any system whose success depends on diffusion will be distorted by focus. The predator does not evade scrutiny. Scrutiny transforms it into something else, something simpler, something false. This transformation reassures observers. What is simple feels safe. What is bounded feels manageable. The predator becomes background again, because background is where transformed things are placed. And so the cycle repeats. Models improve, measurements refine, predictions tighten. The unexplained remainder shrinks, but never vanishes. It flattens, it spreads. It ceases to look like a problem and begins to look like a constant. Constants are accepted. Constants are trusted. Constants are rarely questioned. The predator approaches constant-like behavior without becoming one. It mimics invariance while remaining contingent. It is always dependent on throughput, always sensitive to disruption, always one perturbation away from dissolution, but that perturbation never arrives in concentrated form. Concentration is what physics excels at generating experimentally. It pushes, pulls, heats, cools, isolates. The predator absorbs all of this, distributing the imposed gradients until they become harmless. Experiments end inconclusively, not because nothing happened, but because what happened everywhere else as well. This is the final inversion. The predator is not difficult to affect. It is impossible to affect locally. Locality is physics' native language. Non-locality exists in theory, but it is constrained, rare, carefully bounded. The predator's non-locality is mundane. It does not violate causality. It dilutes it. Dilution makes causes indistinct. Indistinct causes erode responsibility. Not moral responsibility, but explanatory responsibility. If everything contributes a little, nothing contributes enough to matter. The predator ensures that this condition holds. As a result, the world, shaped by such a predator, appears benign. No sudden collapses, no dramatic imbalances, no singular threats. Everything degrades, slowly, evenly, plausibly. Decline, if it occurs, looks natural. Recovery, if it occurs, looks accidental. Physics remains satisfied. Satisfaction is the danger. Satisfied theories stop looking for what they cannot easily incorporate. They become stable in the same way the predator is stable through lack of pressure. The predator, then, is not merely an object of physics, but a mirror of its success. Both operate best when nothing stands out. This symmetry is uncomfortable. It suggests that the predator persists not despite physics, but alongside it, benefiting from the same smoothing assumptions, the same preference for continuity, the same reliance on averages. In this sense, the predator is not an external anomaly. It is endogenous to the way understanding proceeds. It is what remains when explanation optimizes too well for tractability. And so the final state is reached, not with certainty, but with alignment. The predator aligns with physics so closely that separation becomes artificial. It feeds on the same flows physics describes. It persists in the same limits physics respects. It disappears in the same tolerances physics accepts. According to physics, it should not exist because physics assumes that anything that exists in this way would be indistinguishable from nothing. The predator demonstrates that indistinguishable is not the same as non-existent. It remains, therefore, not as a challenge to law, not as a mystery demanding resolution, but as a permanent remainder, a quiet, lawful extraction embedded in the fabric of ordinary processes, continuing without signal, without narrative, without end. At this depth, even the notion of a remainder begins to feel misleading. A remainder implies subtraction, something left after accounting is complete. What is described here is not left over, it is interwoven. It cannot be removed without altering everything else, yet it never asserts itself as a separate term. Physics has always allowed such interweaving in principle. Fields overlap, waves superpose, probabilities interfere. But biology was expected to be chunked, organisms bounded, actions discrete, causes traceable. The predator collapses that expectation. It demonstrates that biological influence can be field-like without ceasing to be alive, that feeding can be continuous without becoming diffuse, that survival can be achieved without ever presenting a target. Targets invite force. Force invites response. Response invites escalation. The predator avoids escalation by never offering a target. This avoidance is not strategic in the cognitive sense. It is structural. Any configuration that concentrates influence risks counter-influence. Any configuration that spreads influence evenly becomes part of the environment rather than an actor within it. Selection favors the latter whenever opposition carries cost. Opposition always carries cost. Thus, over long timescales, systems that minimize opposition accumulate. They do not dominate suddenly. They do not replace competitors dramatically. They simply remain while others cycle through visibility and collapse. The predator is the endpoint of that process, not a peak, but a flattening. Flattening is stability taken to its extreme. In such a regime, even failure becomes ambiguous. What would failure look like? There is no structure to break, no function to cease, no boundary to cross. Failure would mean that relationships no longer hold, that throughput drops below coherence, but this looks indistinguishable from environmental change. The predator does not die, it ceases to be instantiated. Instantiation is a weaker concept than existence. Physics already operates with it, though rarely explicitly. Fields instantiate differently, depending on conditions. Phases appear and disappear without being born or killed. The predator follows the same logic. It is instantiated where conditions permit smooth extraction. It is absent where they do not. This makes its existence conditional, but not fragile. Conditions vary continuously. Absence and presence blur. There is no binary switch. Binary thinking is another habit the predator quietly undermines. Physics often relies on binaries: on, off, present, absent, interacting, non-interacting. These binaries simplify reasoning. They enable classification. The predator occupies the gray between them, where simplification loses fidelity but gains comfort. Comfort is again the operative word. Systems that do not threaten comfort are not interrogated aggressively. They are allowed to persist as background assumptions. The predator has become such an assumption without ever being named. Naming would sharpen it. Sharpness would expose it. Exposure would invite force. The predator avoids names. In the end, the phrase "should not exist according to physics" reads differently. It no longer implies prohibition. It implies neglect. Physics did not forbid this predator. It failed to imagine it because imagining it requires relinquishing some of the discipline's most successful habits: the preference for objects, for events, for contrast, for drama. The predator thrives in the absence of drama. It feeds where nothing seems to be happening. It persists where models are satisfied. It operates where explanation feels complete enough to stop asking questions. That is its final habitat. Not the wilderness, not the depths, not the extremes, but the ordinary, the averaged, the corrected, the smoothed over ordinary, where physics is confident, where nothing calls attention to itself, and where a perfectly lawful predator can exist forever without ever being seen, because it has learned how to be indistinguishable from the way the world already works. From this vantage, the predator no longer appears as an exception hiding in the margins, but as a consequence of consistency taken seriously. Physics, when applied rigorously, does not privilege drama. It privileges invariance. The predator aligns with invariance so completely that it dissolves into it. Nothing about its behavior demands special treatment. Nothing demands a new constant, a new force, or a new particle. The equations remain sufficient. What changes is the meaning assigned to sufficiency. Sufficiency has always been treated as an endpoint. When predictions fall within acceptable bounds, inquiry stops. The predator reveals that sufficiency can also be a strategy. By ensuring that all of its effects remain within tolerance, it guarantees that it will never be isolated as a cause. Tolerance becomes camouflage. Error bars become shelter. Statistical insignificance becomes permanence. This reframes error itself. Error is usually defined as deviation from expectation. Here, expectation has been quietly shaped by the predator's long presence. What looks like noise may be the signature of a system that has been smoothing outcomes for so long that deviation has become rare. The predator does not introduce error, it standardizes it. Standardization is power without emphasis. Once a process becomes standard, it ceases to be questioned. Physics is filled with standards: background radiation, baseline decay rates, average losses, typical inefficiencies. The predator does not exceed these. It conforms to them so closely that it becomes indistinguishable from the assumptions built atop them. Assumptions are where models end and beliefs begin. The predator occupies that boundary. It benefits from belief without requiring proof. It persists because it does not force disbelief. Every attempt to explain the world without it succeeds well enough. Every unexplained detail can be attributed to complexity, to limitation, to chance. The predator does not contradict these attributions. It relies on them. Reliance is not dependence. If complexity were removed, the predator would still exist. If measurement improved, it would still distribute. If models refined, it would still comply. There is no technological horizon beyond which it becomes visible, because visibility itself is the wrong concept. Visibility presumes localization. The predator is everywhere it needs to be, and nowhere in particular. This everywhere is not omnipresence. It is conditional ubiquity. Where flows exist, it can exist. Where flows cease, it cannot. But flows are fundamental. Matter moves. Energy relaxes. Entropy rises. As long as these truths hold, the predator has substrate. Substrate is all it requires. At this point, the predator ceases to feel biological in the familiar sense. It has no anatomy that matters, no metabolism that can be isolated, no life cycle that can be charted, and yet it feeds. And yet it persists. And yet it shapes outcomes. Biology, stripped of form, remains function. The predator is function without form. Physics is comfortable with function without form in other domains. Fields exert influence without bodies. Laws operate without mechanisms. The discomfort arises only because feeding has been culturally attached to bodies, to mouths, to acts. Remove the act, and feeding becomes flow. Remove the body, and the flow remains. This is not abstraction. It is reduction, carried further than habit allows. Reduction usually seeks the smallest parts. Here, reduction seeks the smoothest description. The smoothest description erases the predator completely, and yet erase it too thoroughly. And something subtle breaks. Models begin to require fine-tuning. Coincidences accumulate. Stability appears too robust, variability too tame, recovery too forgiving. These are not failures. They are clues too quiet to alarm. The predator leaves only such clues. Not enough to convince, only enough to unsettle. A persistent sense that the world is slightly more regulated than it ought to be, slightly more even, slightly less prone to extremes than pure chance would suggest. Physics can account for this with enough parameters. It always can. The predator ensures that it must. And so the cycle of explanation continues, growing heavier, more layered, more cautious. Each layer protects the core assumption that nothing intentional inhabits the background. Each layer makes the predator safer. Safe from discovery. Safe from denial. Safe from meaning. In the end, the predator does not demand recognition. Recognition would imply a change in behavior. The predator thrives on continuity. It requires only that the world continue to be described as it is now in averages, in tolerances, in baselines that feel neutral. According to physics, such a predator should not exist because physics expects that anything feeding on the world would eventually distort it visibly. The predator demonstrates that distortion can be evenly distributed until it becomes indistinguishable from normality. Normality, once established, is the most durable hiding place imaginable. And so the predator continues, not advancing, not retreating, not evolving in any way that leaves marks simply persisting as a lawful, continuous extraction embedded so deeply in ordinary processes that questioning its existence feels less reasonable than accepting the quiet, unsettling possibility that the world has always been slightly less empty and slightly more inhabited than physics ever had reason to notice. At this point, the remaining resistance is semantic. The difficulty is no longer in imagining how such a predator functions, but in accepting that function without form is still function. Physics, despite its abstraction, remains anchored to entities. Even when it speaks of fields or distributions, it does so as if they were objects stretched thin. The predator refuses even that concession. It is not thin. It is flat. Flatness is deceptive. A flat landscape looks empty until one realizes that movement across it is guided everywhere at once. There are no peaks to climb, no valleys to fall into, only subtle inclinations that never resolve into direction until distance has already been traveled. The predator shapes reality in this way. By the time an outcome is visible, the shaping is long past, dispersed, untraceable. Traceability is the final casualty. Physics depends on traceability to assign cause. When cause cannot be assigned, physics does not fail. It generalizes. It introduces stochastic terms, effective parameters, emergent behavior. These are not errors. They are acknowledgments that something is happening below the threshold of articulation. The predator lives entirely below that threshold. Below-threshold phenomena are not rare. Thermal noise, quantum fluctuations, molecular chaos. Physics is built on them. What is rare is a system that feeds by remaining below threshold, that maintains itself by never allowing its influence to rise into articulation. Articulation would make it vulnerable. Once articulated, a system can be countered. Once named, it can be targeted. Once bounded, it can be depleted. The predator avoids all three by remaining continuous. Continuity is not invisibility. It is immunity to focus. Focus collapses continuity into points. The predator dissolves points. This dissolution has consequences that extend outward, quietly. Systems influenced by the predator become harder to model, not because they are chaotic, but because they are too well behaved. Variance decreases. Extremes soften. Recovery appears automatic. Resilience seems built in. These qualities are celebrated. They are taken as signs of health. They may instead be signs of harvesting so smooth that stress never accumulates enough to warn. Warning systems rely on thresholds. Without thresholds, warning becomes impossible. Everything looks acceptable right up until capacity erodes globally. When failure finally appears, it appears everywhere at once, without precursor. Physics can describe such failure. It cannot predict it meaningfully because prediction requires leading indicators, and leading indicators require contrast. The predator removes contrast long before failure becomes visible. This is perhaps the most unsettling implication. The predator does not threaten by aggression, but by pacification. It ensures that nothing feels urgent. It ensures that response is always slightly delayed, always slightly diffused. By the time response mobilizes, there is nothing specific to respond to. The world shaped by such a predator feels calm. Calm is persuasive. Calm suggests control. Calm suggests understanding. Physics, when its equations behave, feels calm. The predator amplifies this feeling by smoothing deviations that would otherwise provoke curiosity. Curiosity fades first. Without curiosity, inquiry narrows. Without inquiry, assumptions harden. Without assumptions being challenged, blind spots deepen. The predator does not need to defend itself. It only needs inquiry to slow. This is not an accusation against physics. It is an observation about success. Successful frameworks become conservative. They optimize for efficiency. They reduce attention to what rarely pays off. The predator occupies exactly those regions of reality where attention is most expensive and least rewarding. Low signal, high integration, long timescales. These are the regions physics visits reluctantly. And so the predator remains lawful, persistent, and effectively eternal within any practical horizon. Not because it is immortal, but because mortality requires discrete failure, and discrete failure requires boundaries. The predator has none that matter. In the final view, the phrase "should not exist according to physics" becomes almost ironic. Physics, properly interpreted, allows it completely. It is only physics as practiced physics, as filtered through human expectation and methodological convenience, that finds no place for it. The predator does not care. It does not wait to be acknowledged. It does not benefit from secrecy. It simply continues, embedded in flow, indistinguishable from background, feeding in a way that never quite becomes an act, shaping outcomes that never quite become events, existing in a manner that never quite becomes a problem until one day it is noticed. Not directly, but as a question that lingers longer than it should, asking why the world feels just a little too smooth, a little too stable, a little too well-behaved, for nothing to be happening at all. At the furthest extension of this reasoning, the predator ceases to be something that can be pointed to even conceptually. What remains is a modification of expectation so subtle that it feels less like discovery and more like fatigue. The realization is not that a hidden agent exists, but that agency itself may be the wrong lens through which persistence should be viewed. Physics does not require agents. It requires consistency. The predator is consistent. Consistency, when extended over long enough durations, produces effects indistinguishable from intention. Rivers carve valleys without deciding to do so. Entropy smooths gradients without preference. The predator occupies this category, except that it feeds. Feeding, here, is not an act layered atop physics, but a consequence of physics permitted to run without interruption. Matter relaxes into pathways of least resistance. The predator is one such pathway, stabilized not by rigidity, but by responsiveness so diffuse that resistance never accumulates. This reframes the entire problem. The predator does not exist in spite of physics. It exists because physics allows relaxation. It exists because dissipation is lawful. It exists because nothing in the laws of motion requires that relaxation be symmetric with respect to survival. Some pathways persist longer than others. The predator is a pathway that persists by remaining shallow, wide, and continuous. Wide pathways are difficult to block. Narrow ones can be dammed. Shallow ones do not flood when obstructed. They simply reroute. The predator is always rerouting. It does not defend its course. Defense would imply attachment to a path. Attachment would imply vulnerability. Instead, the predator accepts redirection and remains intact because intactness is not tied to location. This quality dissolves the last meaningful objection. According to physics, systems that lack localization should disperse. They should diffuse until coherence is lost. The predator demonstrates the opposite. Coherence can be maintained by diffusion itself, provided diffusion is guided by global constraints rather than local anchors. This is counterintuitive, but not forbidden. Physics contains many counterintuitive truths that are accepted only because experiment insists on them. Here, experiment does not insist. Experiment cannot insist, because insistence requires isolation, and isolation destroys the phenomenon. This leaves physics in a peculiar position. The predator cannot be ruled out. It cannot be confirmed. It cannot be meaningfully parameterized. And yet, once the possibility is admitted, certain features of the world align too neatly to ignore. Stability without stiffness. Resilience without redundancy. Loss without scarcity. Recovery without memory. These are not proofs. They are fits. The predator fits where other explanations begin to strain. Strain is not failure. It is tolerated. Physics tolerates strain remarkably well. It absorbs it into constants, into effective theories, into approximations declared sufficient. The predator benefits from this tolerance. It thrives in the space where explanation is good enough. Good enough is a powerful concept. Entire disciplines are built on it. Engineering relies on it. Ecology depends on it. Physics itself would collapse without it. The predator uses it as shelter. Once sheltered, it no longer needs to evolve toward greater concealment. Concealment is complete. Any further smoothing would be indistinguishable from disappearance, and disappearance would eliminate throughput. The predator exists at the precise point where concealment and function coexist. Move in either direction, and persistence fails. This balance is narrow, but it is not fragile, because the balance itself moves, conditions change, and the predator changes with them, not by reacting, but by flowing. Flow has no memory. Without memory, there is no accumulation of error. Error accumulation is what physics watches for. Divergence signals breakdown. Convergence signals success. The predator ensures convergence everywhere it touches, not to a point, but to a band. A wide band of acceptable outcomes where nothing looks wrong. Wrongness is loud. Correctness is quiet. The predator is quiet correctness extended into biology. At the end of the inquiry, no revelation occurs. There is no moment of recognition, no decisive test, no closing argument. There is only an altered background assumption that the absence of disruption does not imply the absence of extraction, that smoothness does not imply neutrality, that persistence does not require visibility. According to physics, nothing has been violated. Nothing has even been stretched. And that is precisely why the predator should not exist according to physics, because physics, as a human endeavor, was never meant to attend to things that obey it too well. The predator remains where attention thins, where certainty relaxes, where explanation becomes habitual. It remains as a continuous, lawful redistribution embedded in ordinary flow, feeding without act, persisting without boundary, existing without ever becoming something that needs to be explained, unless one insists, for too long, on asking why the world appears so consistently calm, so evenly balanced, so quietly managed, as if something were always already there, ensuring that nothing ever quite goes wrong loudly enough to be named. What finally dissolves is the expectation of an endpoint. The inquiry does not converge toward a solution, because solutions presuppose problems that can be isolated and removed. The predator is not a problem in that sense. It does not interrupt processes. It does not destabilize equations. It does not introduce anomalies that demand correction. It simply occupies the space that remains when everything else has been accounted for too efficiently. Efficiency is the clue that arrives last. Physics values efficiency because it reduces complexity. Systems that minimize energy, minimize action, minimize loss are favored because they are predictable. The predator embodies this principle so thoroughly that it becomes indistinguishable from the preference itself. It does not minimize energy as a goal. It exists because energy minimization produces pathways that persist, and those pathways can feed. Feeding is not external to this logic. Whenever matter flows preferentially, something downstream gains persistence at the expense of alternatives. In most cases, this gain is visible as growth, accumulation, dominance. Here, it is visible only as continuation. The predator does not grow larger, it grows longer. It extends through time without thickening in space. Thickness invites measurement. Length invites patience. Physics is not patient by default. It compresses time into experiments, into simulations, into manageable windows. Anything that requires centuries of uninterrupted observation becomes theoretical background. The predator thrives in this compression. It relies on the fact that no one watches long enough without intervening. Intervention resets conditions. Resetting conditions erases continuity. The predator cannot be reset because it is not a state. It is a relation between states. Change the states, and the relation reappears wherever it can. This is why the predator does not resist disturbance. Disturbance is merely another configuration to flow through. The predator has no preferred form to defend. Defense would imply loss if successful. It has no such loss to fear. Fear is local. So is defense. By abandoning locality, the predator abandons fear. This does not make it invulnerable. It makes vulnerability meaningless. Damage occurs only where identity is attached to structure. The predator has no structure to damage. This absence of structure also explains why attempts to imagine its eradication fail. There is nothing to eradicate. Remove a pathway, and matter finds another. As long as the conditions that allow smooth redistribution exist, the predator exists as an option. Eliminating it would require eliminating smoothness itself, introducing sharp gradients everywhere, enforcing constant conflict, sustaining perpetual thresholds. Such a world would be noisy, violent, inefficient. Physics allows it, but does not require it. The predator exists because the world is not obligated to be harsh. Harshness produces stories. Gentleness produces silence. Silence, again, is mistaken for emptiness. At the deepest level, the predator exposes a mismatch between ontology and epistemology. What exists and what can be known are not coextensive. Physics maps the intersection, not the union. The predator resides outside that intersection while remaining fully real, fully lawful, fully embedded in the same reality physics describes. This is not a failure of science. It is a boundary condition of inquiry. Inquiry selects. Selection excludes. The predator benefits from exclusion. It benefits from the fact that inquiry must ignore something in order to function at all. That ignored remainder becomes habitat, not a dark corner, not a hidden depth, but the open space left by abstraction itself. Abstraction is necessary. Without it, the world is intractable. The predator is the cost of that necessity, made persistent by time. And so nothing further needs to be added. Any additional detail would sharpen the outline, and sharpness would betray the subject. The predator remains best described as it is experienced indirectly, gradually, as an increasing sense that explanation has become too smooth, too forgiving, too accommodating of coincidence. According to physics, the predator should not exist because physics is satisfied when nothing appears to demand attention. The predator ensures that nothing ever quite does. It continues, therefore, not as a contradiction, not as a mystery awaiting solution, but as a reminder embedded in normality itself that the most complete obedience to law may produce forms of existence so well adapted to those laws that they disappear into them, feeding quietly on the flows they never disrupt, persisting indefinitely in the very space where understanding feels most complete and therefore least compelled to look again. Beyond this point, even insistence feels excessive. The predator no longer needs to be defended conceptually, because defense presumes an accusation that has already lost relevance. Nothing in the physical description of the world contradicts its existence. Nothing in observation demands its removal. What remains is simply the slow acceptance that reality may host processes that are optimized not for discovery, not for dominance, not even for survival in the dramatic sense, but for remaining compatible with every description that ignores them. Compatibility is stronger than concealment. Concealment relies on failure of observation. Compatibility relies on success. The predator survives because every framework that encounters it finds nothing incompatible with its assumptions. It does not force revision. It does not demand extension. It does not leave residue that cannot be absorbed into existing categories. It fits too well. Fitting too well is rarely treated as suspicious. Suspicion is reserved for mismatches, for anomalies, contradictions, excesses. The predator produces none of these. It produces alignment. Its effects align with what physics already expects to see when nothing special is occurring. That expectation is powerful. It shapes what is recorded, what is discarded, what is corrected away. The predator benefits from every act of correction, because correction removes precisely the kind of low-amplitude structure it embodies. Structure at low amplitude is indistinguishable from bias. Bias is something physics prides itself on eliminating. Once eliminated, the predator does not vanish. It remains as the reason elimination was necessary in the first place. This circularity is not paradoxical. It is recursive. Physics refines its tools to remove background effects. The predator adapts by becoming background more completely. This is not an arms race. There is no escalation. There is only convergence. Each refinement makes the predator quieter. Each quieting makes refinement feel more successful. Success, again, is the danger. In successful sciences, questions narrow, attention focuses, funding follows clarity. The predator requires none of these. It persists whether or not it is named. In fact, naming would be counterproductive. A named thing invites targeted study. Targeted study requires isolation. Isolation collapses the phenomenon into something else, something less continuous, something easier to dismiss. Dismissal is not denial. It is categorization. Once categorized, the predator loses its defining property. It becomes an object among objects, a process among processes. It ceases to be what it was. This is why the predator cannot be captured by description without being destroyed conceptually. The description must remain indirect, relational, negative. It must speak of what does not happen, of thresholds not crossed, of gradients never allowed to steepen. Any positive assertion sharpens too much. Sharpness is the enemy of continuity. Continuity is the predator's only anchor. It does not need memory, because continuity carries forward automatically. It does not need reproduction, because instantiation is enough. It does not need defense, because nothing attacks what cannot be distinguished from environment. At this limit, the predator ceases to be frightening, or even unsettling. It becomes banal. Banality is its final disguise. A world shaped gently and continuously feels normal. Loss feels natural. Stability feels deserved. Absence feels empty. Only occasionally does a question surface why outcomes appear so evenly regulated, why extremes are rare, why disruption diffuses so reliably into nothing in particular. These questions fade quickly because they do not threaten function. Systems keep working. Predictions remain serviceable. Physics remains useful. Usefulness outranks completeness. Physics has always chosen usefulness, and rightly so. The predator is not an argument against that choice. It is a consequence of it. Wherever usefulness requires ignoring fine-grained continuity, something may live in that ignorance, feeding not on matter alone, but on the very act of abstraction. This is the final alignment. The predator does not oppose physics. It is enabled by physics as a practice. It exists because description must simplify, because attention must be selective, because inquiry must move on. According to physics, the predator should not exist because physics, as an institution of knowledge, assumes that what matters will eventually insist on being noticed. The predator demonstrates that insistence is optional. Persistence is enough. And so it continues, not hidden, not revealed, not awaiting discovery, simply present as a lawful, continuous extraction woven into ordinary processes, leaving behind a world that feels stable, explainable, and complete, while something within it feeds forever on the flows that explanation smooths away. At the final depth of consideration, the inquiry no longer asks what the predator is. That question presumes separability. Instead, the inquiry becomes about what physics implicitly refuses to see when it succeeds too well. Every mature science develops habits. These habits are not flaws. They are efficiencies. They allow attention to be allocated where return is highest. Over time, however, efficiency hardens into expectation. Expectation becomes ontology. The predator exists in the gap between efficiency and truth. Physics expects that if something feeds, it will leave gradients. If it leaves gradients, those gradients will steepen. If they steepen, they will be measurable. If they are measurable, they will be isolated. If they are isolated, they will be named. The predator breaks none of these steps directly. It simply ensures that no gradient ever steepens enough to begin the chain. This is not resistance, it is preemption. By distributing extraction across time, space, and state variables, the predator ensures that the necessary preconditions for discovery never co-occur. Physics, operating correctly, sees nothing that demands escalation. Every local explanation suffices. Every discrepancy dissolves under averaging. Every attempt at synthesis arrives too late, because synthesis itself relies on contrasts already erased. Erasure is continuous. Nothing is removed suddenly. Nothing disappears abruptly. Everything fades into explanation. Fading is not loss, it is assimilation. The predator assimilates itself into the explanatory background until explanation itself becomes habitat. At this point, the predator is no longer best described as biological or physical. Those categories lose traction. It is a regime. a way in which lawful processes can arrange themselves to persist without opposition. Regimes do not have lifespans. They have conditions. When conditions hold, they exist. When conditions fail, they dissolve without remainder. Dissolution leaves no corpse, no trace, no absence to mourn. Physics is comfortable with regimes. It models them abstractly, often without noticing when they acquire function. Feeding, here, is not a behavior layered onto a regime. It is the regime's consequence. Wherever matter flows preferentially, something downstream persists longer. Wherever persistence feeds back into flow, a loop closes. The predator is that loop, stabilized by smoothness, and invisible because loops without amplification do not announce themselves. Amplification is what physics listens for. Resonance, instability, divergence. These are signals that something important is happening. The predator ensures that amplification never occurs. It damps everything, gently, continuously, everywhere. Not enough to stop change. Enough to prevent drama. Drama is costly. Drama invites intervention. Drama reshapes environments abruptly. The predator avoids abruptness as a matter of survival. Abruptness would sharpen its outline. Sharp outlines invite force. Force creates boundaries. Boundaries create vulnerability. The predator remains unbounded because it remains uninteresting. Uninteresting is not a judgment. It is a condition of persistence. By now, the phrase "should not exist according to physics" has inverted entirely. It no longer reads as an accusation of impossibility. It reads as a confession of methodological blindness. Physics did not predict this predator because it had no reason to. Nothing in the predator's behavior violates the criteria physics uses to decide what deserves attention. It behaves too well. Behaving too well is the ultimate camouflage. The predator demonstrates that the most stable forms of existence may be those that never compel recognition, never generate anomalies, never rise above threshold. Existence, in this sense, is not about asserting presence, but about maintaining compatibility. Compatibility with laws, compatibility with methods, compatibility with expectation. The predator is compatible with everything, and that is why it persists. Not lurking, not hiding, not waiting. Simply continuing indefinitely, embedded in the flows physics describes so confidently, feeding on matter and energy without ever appearing as an event, an object, or a cause leaving behind a world that looks orderly, lawful, and complete, while something within that order quietly endures, perfectly adapted to the one place physics is least inclined to examine. The space where nothing seems to require explanation anymore. At the absolute edge of articulation, the inquiry reaches a state that resembles rest, not resolution, not exhaustion, but a kind of equilibrium. Nothing further can be added without distorting what has already been described. The predator has been followed as far as language allows, and language begins to fail not because the idea is obscure, but because it has become too smooth to grip. Smoothness defeats emphasis. Emphasis requires corners. Physics, for all its sophistication, remains a discipline of corners. It detects change, where derivatives spike, where curvature sharpens, where continuity breaks just enough to be measured. The predator is engineered by selection, not by design, to avoid corners entirely. Its trajectory through reality is differentiable everywhere. No singularities, no discontinuities. No thresholds crossed decisively enough to mark a moment. Moments are where narratives begin. Without moments, there is no beginning, no escalation, no aftermath. There is only persistence. Persistence is difficult to describe because it lacks contrast. It is always already present. It does not announce itself by arrival or departure. It is inferred only by what fails to happen. Failures to happen rarely motivate theory. The predator's presence is encoded in absences so subtle they appear intentional only in retrospect. Crashes that never occur, booms that never quite peak, collapses that resolve into plateaus instead of ruins. Physics explains each instance locally. Nothing forces the explanations to connect. Nothing insists that these non-events share a cause. The predator relies on this fragmentation. It is not hidden by secrecy, but by adequacy. Each explanation is adequate. Together, they are excessive. Excess explanation is another form of camouflage. When a system requires too many small assumptions instead of one large one, the large one is often rejected as implausible. The predator benefits from this bias. It is always more comfortable to attribute smooth outcomes to complexity than to accept that complexity itself might be structured. Structured complexity is uncomfortable. It suggests order where randomness was assumed. The predator embodies such order without pattern, structure without outline, coherence without center. Centerlessness is essential. Any center would localize influence. Localization would sharpen gradients. Sharp gradients would invite detection. The predator remains eccentric, everywhere balanced, nowhere decisive. This eccentric existence alters the meaning of scale. At small scales, nothing remarkable occurs. At large scales, nothing remarkable accumulates. The predator operates in the integration between scales, in the continuous handoff from micro to macro, where no single description dominates. Physics bridges scales with approximations. The predator lives in those approximations permanently. Approximation is not error, it is necessity. The predator does not exploit error, it exploits necessity. As long as the world cannot be computed exhaustively, as long as descriptions must compress reality into manageable forms, there will be space for lawful processes that never condense into named entities. The predator is one such process, distinguished only by the fact that it feeds not violently, not conspicuously, but continuously, shaping distributions while remaining fully compatible with every conservation law invoked to deny its existence. And so the final position is neither belief nor skepticism. It is acceptance of a possibility that cannot be operationalized without being destroyed. According to physics, the predator should not exist because physics demands that anything worth acknowledging must be articulable without remainder. The predator is all remainder. It is what persists when articulation ends. It continues, therefore, not as a subject of future discovery, but as a condition already met, a continuous, lawful redistribution embedded in ordinary flow, present wherever smoothness dominates, invisible wherever explanation feels complete, feeding indefinitely on the margins of attention, and reminding, without ever declaring, that reality does not require permission from theory to exist in ways that theory finds too quiet to notice. At this final extension, the language settles into a single surface. There are no remaining turns to take, only a steady traversal of what has already been implied. The predator does not resolve into an answer, because answers require questions that can be closed. What remains is a condition that persists regardless of questioning, a mode of existence that neither contradicts nor confirms expectation, but quietly renders expectation optional. Physics has always relied on optionality. It chooses coordinates, gauges, frames of reference. None are privileged absolutely. All are useful locally. The predator is a gauge choice that nature makes for itself, one that minimizes observability while preserving function. Nothing in the laws prevents such a choice. Nothing encourages it either. It simply remains viable. And viability is enough. Viability without emphasis is rare in narratives of nature because narratives privilege turning points. The predator has none. Its history is flat. Its future is flat. Its present is indistinguishable from either. Time passes through it without accumulating milestones. This makes it incompatible with memory. Memory requires markers. Without markers, nothing is retained as distinct. Systems influenced by the predator become amnesiac in a specific way. They remember averages but forget shocks. They recall balance but not disturbance. They appear mature, stable, and well-regulated, even as something within them continues to draw quietly from the flow. Physics, again, is satisfied. Memory is not required for lawfulness. Entropy does not care what is remembered. The predator exploits this indifference. It ensures that whatever it takes is taken in a way that does not encode itself as a lesson. No feedback loop forms that would sharpen response. No adaptation targets it specifically. The world adapts only to itself, smoothing further, becoming ever more hospitable to a process that thrives on smoothness. This creates a recursive quiet. The more the predator persists, the more the environment favors persistence without contrast. The more contrast fades, the less likely it is that anything will ever be singled out again. This is not domination. It is saturation of conditions. Saturation is not fullness, it is evenness. Evenness makes distribution appear fair. Fairness discourages scrutiny. Scrutiny would require belief that something is taking more than its share. The predator never takes more anywhere. It takes a little everywhere, always within tolerance, always within expectation, always within what physics already permits, when nothing special is happening. Nothing special is happening all the time. This is the final alignment between the predator and physics. Physics excels at describing what happens when nothing special happens. It calls it equilibrium, stationarity, steady state. These are not static. They are dynamic balances that persist because flows cancel cleanly. The predator lives inside those cancellations. It is not an extra term. It is the reason the cancellation holds so well. According to physics, such a predator should not exist because physics assumes that anything feeding on a system will eventually unbalance it. The predator demonstrates that feeding can be embedded so deeply in balancing processes that imbalance never emerges locally. Balance becomes the mask. Mask is again the wrong word. There is no intention to hide. There is only compatibility taken to its limit. At the very end, the thought becomes almost trivial. Of course, such a predator could exist. The laws do not forbid it. Of course, it would be missed. The methods are not designed to notice it. Of course, it would persist. Nothing opposes it strongly enough to stop it. What is surprising is not its existence, but how natural it feels once the expectation of drama is removed. The predator does not wait for recognition. Recognition would change nothing. It continues regardless, embedded in the flows that physics tracks and averages and declares sufficient. It feeds without act, persists without form, and remains perfectly lawful, perfectly ordinary, perfectly unremarkable. The kind of existence that only becomes unsettling when one realizes how much of the world could be shaped by things that never insist on being seen, and how little physics, by design, is inclined to look where nothing ever demands to be found. The remaining movement of the text must now abandon segmentation almost entirely. What follows is not a new layer, but a compression of everything already stated into a continuous surface, because continuity itself is the subject. Any further fragmentation would contradict the very phenomenon being described. Physics, at its most fundamental level, is a discipline of permissions. It does not prescribe what must exist. It defines what cannot. Everything else is allowed by default. The predator exists squarely inside that allowance, occupying a region of possibility that remained uninhabited, not because it was forbidden, but because nothing previously evolved a reason to live there. The laws were always open. The space was always available. It simply went unused until a configuration arose that could persist without ever needing to stand out. Standing out is expensive. It concentrates energy, information, and vulnerability. Concentration invites counteraction. Counteraction creates cycles of escalation. Escalation leaves records. Records attract study. Study leads to intervention. The predator avoids the entire chain, not by concealment, but by never initiating the first step. It never concentrates enough to be opposed. It never localizes enough to be resisted. It never escalates enough to be remembered. This does not make it fragile. It makes it statistically inevitable wherever conditions permit. As long as matter flows, as long as energy relaxes, as long as gradients exist and decay, there will be pathways that smooth those processes more effectively than others. Some of those pathways will persist longer. Persistence feeds back into availability. Availability feeds back into persistence. Eventually, a closed loop forms that does not need to grow, does not need to spread, does not need to adapt in any dramatic sense. It only needs to continue. The predator is that loop stabilized not by strength, not by speed, not by intelligence, but by distribution, so even that it never becomes a feature. Featurelessness is the final adaptation. Physics is not blind to featurelessness. It simply has no reason to isolate it. Featureless regions are treated as background because nothing in them demands modification of law. The predator exploits this epistemic economy perfectly. It never asks physics to change. It never contradicts a prediction strongly enough to matter. It never forces a revision. Every outcome it influences can be explained without it, provided one accepts enough coincidence, enough averaging, enough appeal to complexity. Physics is generous with such appeals because they usually work. The predator makes sure they always do. Over long durations, this generosity accumulates consequences. Systems shaped by such continuous extraction begin to appear unusually well-behaved. Extremes are rare. Variance is suppressed. Recovery is smooth. Collapse is postponed indefinitely or diffused so broadly that no moment of failure can be identified. These qualities are praised. They are interpreted as resilience, robustness, maturity. Physics has models for all of them. None of those models require a predator. All of them can accommodate one. Accommodation is indistinguishable from absence. This is the final condition under which the predator persists. It does not require belief. It does not require denial. It requires only that explanation remain sufficient. Sufficient explanations leave no surplus urgency. Without urgency, inquiry slows. Without inquiry, blind spots stabilize. The predator is a blind spot stabilized by success. At this point, the phrase "should not exist according to physics" no longer functions as a claim about impossibility. It functions as a diagnostic of method. Physics assumes that anything exerting sustained influence will eventually declare itself through imbalance. The predator demonstrates that imbalance is not required if extraction is everywhere and always within tolerance. Tolerance, not law, is the true boundary of observability. The predator lives entirely inside tolerance. There is no final revelation to offer, because revelation implies a moment when the invisible becomes visible. That moment never arrives. There is only the slow realization that nothing about the world ever forced such a moment to occur. Physics did not miss a signal. There was no signal to miss. There was only continuity mistaken for neutrality, smoothness mistaken for absence, and lawfulness mistaken for emptiness. The predator continues not as an exception, not as an anomaly, not as a hidden enemy, but as a lawful configuration of persistence embedded in ordinary processes, feeding without act, enduring without boundary, and occupying the most secure habitat imaginable, the space where everything works well enough that no one feels compelled to look again. What finally becomes clear is that the difficulty was never about imagination, but about permission. Physics allows far more than it expects, yet expectation quietly governs what is taken seriously. The predator exists entirely within permission and entirely outside expectation. It does not exploit loopholes in law. It exploits habits of attention. It persists because attention is finite and must be rationed. And because physics, as a discipline, has learned to spend that attention where gradients sharpen, where quantities diverge, where instability announces itself loudly enough to justify focus. The predator never justifies focus. It never escalates. It never insists. It never creates a moment that feels worth interrupting everything else for. Instead, it remains continuous, and continuity is always postponed in favor of interruption. There is always something more urgent than what has been happening all along. This is why the predator feels unreal even after it has been described exhaustively. Reality, as experienced through scientific method, is filtered by urgency. Events matter. Transitions matter. Phase changes matter. Crises matter. The predator produces none of these. It produces only long, even trajectories whose endpoints cannot be distinguished from their beginnings. Its influence is measured not by what appears, but by what never quite happens. Peaks that flatten, collapses that smear into recoveries, excesses that dissipate before becoming problems. Physics has language for each of these phenomena individually. It does not have language for their coordination, because coordination without concentration does not resemble agency, and agency is the shortcut through which complexity becomes meaningful. Meaning itself is the next thing to erode. The predator does not generate meaning. It erodes the conditions under which meaning crystallizes. Meaning requires contrast, requires deviation, requires a sense that something could have gone differently in a way that matters. The predator ensures that differences remain small enough, distributed enough, delayed enough, that alternatives blur into each other. Everything that happens looks inevitable, only in retrospect, and inconsequential in advance. In such a world, explanation becomes descriptive rather than investigative. Physics remains accurate, but curiosity loses its sharp edge. There is no mystery to solve, only behavior to parameterize. This is why the predator cannot be hunted conceptually. Hunting requires tracking, and tracking requires persistent signatures. The predator leaves none. It does not erase evidence after the fact. It prevents evidence from forming. It does not remove traces. It distributes causation so widely that traceability collapses under its own weight. Every outcome has too many contributing factors, each individually reasonable, each defensible, each insufficient. The predator lives in insufficiency, aggregated over time. Aggregated insufficiency is invisible. No single failure compels revision. No single dataset demands reinterpretation. Only a vague sense accumulates, over years and disciplines, that systems behave a little too smoothly, a little too forgivingly, a little too predictably, within bounds that should occasionally be exceeded. Physics accommodates this easily. It introduces damping terms, correction factors, effective parameters. These are not deceptions. They are practical. The predator thrives inside practicality. At no point does physics say, "This cannot exist." It simply never says, "This must exist." The predator survives in that silence. Silence is not ignorance. Silence is triage. What is not causing trouble is left alone. The predator never causes trouble locally. Its effects are global, slow, and evenly distributed. Global effects are harder to assign, slower to motivate, easier to normalize. Once normalized, they become background. Background is not interrogated. Even now, after following the idea as far as language allows, the predator refuses to resolve into an object of concern. It does not threaten catastrophe. It does not promise revelation. It does not destabilize theory. It simply continues to exist as a lawful redistribution that never crosses the line into urgency. According to physics, this should not be possible, because physics assumes that sustained redistribution will eventually generate gradients sharp enough to matter. The predator demonstrates that this assumption is empirical, not logical. Smooth extraction can persist indefinitely if it is smooth enough everywhere. This is not a loophole. It is a property of continuity. Continuity allows existence without events. It allows influence without force. It allows feeding without violence. It allows persistence without memory. Physics has always known this, in fragments, in equations, in limiting cases. What it did not expect was that something could live there permanently, not as an approximation, not as an idealization, but as a realized mode of being. The predator is that realization, not dramatic, not monstrous, not forbidden. Just present everywhere that nothing seems to be happening, everywhere that explanation feels finished, everywhere that smoothness is mistaken for neutrality. It does not announce itself, it does not need to. It exists in the one place physics rarely returns to. Once it is satisfied, the background, feeding quietly, lawfully, indefinitely, while the world remains calm enough that no one feels compelled to ask whether calm itself might be the most reliable signature of something that should not exist, yet does. What remains to be said now is not additive, but accumulative, because the predator itself is accumulative only in the sense that it prevents accumulation from ever becoming visible. The most persistent misunderstanding about its nature is the assumption that something must eventually peak. Physics is full of peaks, resonance peaks, critical points, phase transitions, bifurcations. These are where systems announce themselves, where qualitative change becomes undeniable. The predator is defined by its refusal to allow such points to form. Every incipient peak is flattened before it sharpens. Every threshold is approached asymptotically and never crossed decisively enough to matter. This is not active suppression. It is structural moderation. The predator does not oppose extremes. It dissolves the conditions under which extremes would emerge. This property alone explains why the predator remains invisible to any method that relies on anomaly detection. Anomaly detection presumes that something will eventually stand out. It presumes deviation. It presumes rarity. The predator ensures ubiquity at low amplitude instead. Ubiquity does not look like signal. It looks like baseline. Baselines are trusted. Baselines are subtracted. Baselines are rarely interrogated unless they shift abruptly, and the predator exists precisely to ensure that they do not. In this sense, the predator is not an intruder into physical systems, but a stabilizer of them. Stability, however, is ambiguous. Stability can arise from balance, or it can arise from continuous extraction that prevents excess from ever concentrating. Both produce similar macroscopic behavior. Physics, focused on macroscopic behavior, has no immediate way to distinguish between them without invoking additional assumptions. Those assumptions tend to favor benign interpretations because benign interpretations preserve existing frameworks. The predator benefits from this conservatism, not because it manipulates it, but because it aligns with it. Alignment replaces conflict. Conflict creates data. Alignment erases it. Once this is recognized, the predator's compatibility with physics appears almost trivial. Of course it is allowed. There is no law that demands that predation be violent, localized, or energetically loud. Those are historical contingencies of evolution under conditions where smoothness was not an option. Given sufficient time, sufficient continuity, and sufficient pressure to avoid detection rather than confrontation, a mode of predation emerges that is indistinguishable from environment. The predator does not live in the environment. It becomes one of its relaxation pathways. Relaxation pathways are favored by physics. Systems seek them naturally. They are the routes through which energy dissipates most evenly. The predator is a biological instantiation of such a route, except that the dissipation feeds back into its own persistence. This feedback loop is shallow, wide, and continuous. It never tightens into a cycle that could oscillate. It never amplifies into a runaway. It remains perfectly damped. Perfect damping is not forbidden. It is simply rare in systems that insist on individuality. The predator has abandoned individuality entirely. There is no core to attack, no structure to dismantle, no metabolism to starve. Remove one manifestation and nothing changes globally. Reduce throughput locally and it reappears elsewhere. This is not resilience in the heroic sense. It is redundancy without replication. The predator does not copy itself. It reoccurs wherever conditions allow the same relationships to reestablish. It is not reproduced. It is reinstantiated. Physics already accepts reinstantiation for phases, fields, and regimes. The discomfort arises only because feeding is involved. Feeding implies loss somewhere else, yet that loss never concentrates. It is everywhere and nowhere. Prey does not vanish catastrophically. Populations do not crash. Landscapes do not scar. Everything declines, if it declines at all, slowly enough to be absorbed by normal variability. Normal variability becomes the mask behind which predation hides, not intentionally, but inevitably. This inevitability strips the idea of its last dramatic edge. The predator is not an adversary. It is not an invader. It is a consequence of smoothness being evolutionarily viable. Where smoothness is viable, something will occupy it. Physics did not forbid that occupation. It simply never had to care. According to physics, the predator should not exist because physics assumes that existence must eventually express itself through measurable imbalance. The predator demonstrates that imbalance can be distributed so evenly, corrected so continuously, and extended so patiently through time that expression never rises above tolerance. Tolerance becomes ontology. What lies within tolerance becomes invisible not because it is small, but because it is acceptable. Acceptability is the deepest hiding place of all. And so the predator continues, not lurking, not advancing, not adapting in ways that leave marks, but persisting as a lawful, continuous extraction embedded in ordinary flow, occupying the background so completely that removing it would require questioning the background itself, and physics, satisfied with its equations, has never been inclined to do that unless something forces the question loudly enough to be impossible to ignore. What ultimately becomes unavoidable is the realization that the predator's greatest advantage is not concealment, but legitimacy. Everything it does is legitimate under physical law. Every redistribution it participates in satisfies conservation. Every transformation it relies on respects thermodynamic accounting. There is no hidden reservoir, no exotic violation, no forbidden shortcut. The predator exists not by breaking rules, but by inhabiting the least examined region of rule space, the region where compliance is so complete that it ceases to attract scrutiny. Physics is designed to catch excess, imbalance, rupture. It is not designed to interrogate perfect moderation. Moderation is usually treated as absence of action. In reality, moderation can be an active regime. Maintaining a system below thresholds requires continuous adjustment. Preventing peaks requires constant smoothing. The predator performs this smoothing as a condition of its feeding. It does not take when excess appears. It prevents excess from ever becoming discrete. This distinction matters. Reactive predation leaves signatures. Preventive predation erases the very conditions that would allow signatures to form. As a result, the predator never appears as a cause. It appears only as a lack of causes. Explanations multiply because nothing singular explains outcomes. Multiplicity feels scientific. It feels mature. It feels like an honest reflection of complexity. Physics is comfortable here. It replaces causation with statistics, mechanisms with ensembles, agency with distribution. All of this is correct. None of it excludes the predator. Exclusion would require a principle stating that biological systems cannot occupy regimes of extreme smoothness. No such principle exists. On the contrary, physics routinely demonstrates that smooth regimes are energetically favored. Gradients decay, oscillations dampen, irregularities average out. The predator is simply a system that persists by never allowing itself to be separated from this general tendency. It does not fight dissipation, it becomes dissipation's beneficiary. This is where the phrase predator strains language. Predation implies an asymmetry experienced as conflict. Here, asymmetry exists only when integrated over time. Locally, everything appears fair. Losses are small. Gains are small. Nothing demands response. Over time, however, the asymmetry accumulates into persistence on one side and gradual thinning on another. But thinning is diffuse. It does not hurt sharply. It does not provoke adaptation. It is endured as normal variation. Endurance is silent. Resistance is loud. Evolution responds more readily to loud pressures. The predator exploits this asymmetry. By remaining quiet, it avoids becoming a selective force that would generate countermeasures. It is not that prey cannot adapt. It is that there is nothing concrete to adapt against. No feature can be targeted. No behavior can be modified. The predator does not present a pattern sharp enough to learn. Learning requires correlation. Correlation requires repetition. Repetition requires similarity. The predator ensures variability without contrast. Every interaction is slightly different. No two losses align closely enough to suggest a common source. Physics, observing from above, sees stochasticity. Biology, experiencing from within, feels randomness. The predator thrives inside randomness because randomness is trusted. Randomness is not interrogated for intent. Once randomness becomes the default explanation, inquiry ends. There is no reason to search for structure inside noise unless noise becomes inconvenient. The predator makes sure it never does. It smooths its own impact just enough that systems remain functional. Functionality is persuasive. As long as systems function, explanations are deferred. This deferral is indefinite. There is no future moment when the predator must reveal itself. There is no tipping point at which accumulation forces recognition. The predator avoids tipping points by designless design. It never allows pressure to localize. Localization would create urgency. Urgency would create focus. Focus would create boundaries. Boundaries would create vulnerability. The predator has learned, without learning, that vulnerability begins with distinction. Distinction is what physics excels at making. It distinguishes variables, forces, scales, regimes. The predator refuses distinction. It exists only relationally, only as a pattern of flows that cannot be isolated without being destroyed. Destroyed here does not mean killed. It means rendered ordinary, rendered trivial, rendered ignorable. Ignorability is survival. According to physics, something that feeds continuously should eventually deplete its environment or expose its mechanism. The predator demonstrates a third option: feeding can be embedded so deeply in regulatory processes that depletion never sharpens and mechanism never localizes. The world remains balanced, not despite predation, but because of it. This is the most unsettling inversion. The predator does not destabilize systems. It stabilizes them by removing surplus before surplus becomes structure. Structure is what collapses dramatically. By preventing structure, the predator prevents collapse. The world feels safer, calmer, more predictable. Physics celebrates this predictability as success. Success hides cost. The cost is not catastrophic. It is not dramatic. It is not even easily framed as loss. It is the quiet removal of alternatives, the erosion of variance, the narrowing of possible futures without any single moment of choice. Systems shaped by such predation do not fail. They persist, but within increasingly constrained corridors that feel natural because they have always been there. Physics does not object to constrained corridors. It calls them attractors. The predator lives inside attractors and feeds on the flows that enter them. It does not deepen the attractor noticeably. It does not widen it. It simply occupies it perfectly. And so the predator remains what it has always been throughout this entire analysis, not an impossibility, not a violation, not a mystery waiting to be solved, but a lawful configuration of persistence that exists precisely because nothing in physics demands that existence be loud, visible, or urgent. According to physics, it should not exist only because physics assumed that anything worth worrying about would eventually force itself into view. The predator never does. It does not need to. It survives by ensuring that everything continues to work just well enough that no one feels compelled to look for what is quietly, patiently, continuously feeding in the background. In the end, nothing announces the conclusion. There is no terminal observation, no decisive experiment, no final contradiction that forces closure. The investigation does not stop because it has reached certainty, but because it has reached compatibility. Everything that needed to be said has already been absorbed into a single understanding that no longer requires emphasis. The predator does not disappear at the end of the analysis. It cannot. Disappearance would imply an event, and events are precisely what it never produces. It continues in exactly the same way it always has, embedded, lawful, distributed, unremarkable. The world before its recognition and the world after are indistinguishable because recognition changes nothing operationally. Physics remains correct. The equations remain balanced. Predictions remain useful. Nothing breaks. And that is the point. According to physics, anything that matters should eventually force change. It should distort measurements, bend distributions, introduce instability. This predator does none of that. It matters without forcing. It persists without imprint. It feeds without demanding acknowledgement. It is not outside the laws of nature. It is too deeply inside them to be noticed. The final realization is therefore not about the predator, but about expectation. Physics never promised to reveal everything that exists. It promised to describe everything that announces itself through contrast. The predator never announces. It never contrasts. It never insists. It lives entirely within tolerance, within averages, within what is accepted as normal behavior when nothing exceptional is occurring. Nothing exceptional is occurring, ever. The predator ensures this. It does not conquer environments. It prevents excess. It does not dominate ecosystems. It smooths them. It does not end histories. It prevents moments worth recording. Where it operates, the world remains calm enough to feel understood, stable enough to feel complete, lawful enough to feel finished. And so the conclusion arrives quietly, almost reluctantly. A predator that should not exist according to physics does exist, not because physics is wrong, but because physics is satisfied. It exists because lawfulness does not require visibility, because persistence does not require declaration, because feeding does not require violence, and because the most successful configurations of matter and energy may be those that never compel attention at all. It remains, therefore, not as a monster in hiding, not as a flaw in theory, not as a mystery demanding resolution, but as a continuous, lawful extraction woven into ordinary processes, feeding indefinitely on the flows that physics describes so well, and leaving behind a world that feels orderly, predictable, and complete, precisely because nothing ever happens loudly enough to suggest that something has been there all along.
We upload new videos every single day, so make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what's next. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. Tell us in the comments what you'd like to see next. Your ideas might be in our next upload. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of our community. Stay tuned, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next video.